This video is about de structures in French, and we're going to answer 3 questions. Why learn them? How do they work? And what are the most important? Why learn them? When you first learn a verb in French, for example, jouer, you learn it in its infinitive form. That means its dictionary form, its base form, and often you have to change that into its conjugated form. For example, je joue, I play, I am playing, I do play, in order to actually use it. But you also realize that there are some cases where you can simply use the infinitive form without changing it. Here's an example. Je peux jouer, I can play. You're using a first verb, a modal verb, which doesn't require the infinitive to change at all in the second verb. Here's another example. Je continue à jouer. I continue to play. I continue playing. You have a first verb, continue, and then a preposition, à, before your infinitive form. There are also other prepositions which can be used before infinitives. Here's our third example. Je refuse de jouer. I refuse to play. You've got the first verb, refuse, and then the preposition de before the infinitive. What's really useful about knowing these types of verbs like refuser, which follow with de and then an infinitive, is that you don't have to change anything in the second verb, and so it makes it easier to build long sentences. Here's an example. C'est une bonne façon de faire en sorte de se relaxer. It's a good way to make sure you relax. How do they work? Let's look at an example. C'est important de, it's important to, and after the phrase or verb, which includes the de, all you need is the infinitive and the other information following it. C'est important de faire le ménage. It's important to do the housework. Faire is the infinitive, and all the other information can come afterwards. C'est important de passer du temps avec sa famille. It's important to spend time with one's family. Passer is the infinitive, which you don't have to change at all, followed by all the other information. C'est important de se reposer parfois. It's important to rest sometimes. This time we have a reflexive verb, se reposer. You need to have that reflexive pronoun before the infinitive all the time. And finally, c'est important de ne pas gaspiller l'eau. It's important to not waste water. This one is negated. We have a ne pas, and the ne pas, instead of going around the verb like it does in its conjugated form, it actually goes before the verb in its infinitive form. What are the most important? Well, we have 2 types of things that can follow with de. We have verbs that follow with de and an infinitive, and we have phrases that follow with de and an infinitive. An example of a verb that follows with de is refuser de, to refuse to. Nous refusons de travailler. We refuse to work. An example of a phrase that follows with de is être en train de, to be in the middle of doing something. Ils sont en train d'étudier. They are in the middle of studying. But there are also little phrases without verbs, like avant de, before. Avant de faire mes devoirs, je veux regarder la télé. Before doing my homework, I want to watch the TV. Here's a list of verbs that follow with de. Refuser de, to refuse to. Essayer de, to try to. Oublier de, to forget to. Décider de, to decide to. Choisir de, to choose to. Rêver de, to dream of. Empêcher de, to prevent from. Proposer de, to suggest. Arrêter de, to stop. Venir de, to have just. Risquer de, to risk. These verbs are all common examples of verbs that follow with de and simply follow the pattern that we have learnt. The infinitive of the second verb will follow after de, then all the other information. Here is a list of phrases that follow with de. Firstly, here's a list of phrases that include other verbs. Avoir besoin de, to need to. Avoir l'habitude de, to be in the habit of. Avoir l'impression de, to have the impression of. Avoir le temps de, to have the time to. Then the negation, ne pas avoir le temps de, to not have the time to. Avoir l'air de, to appear or seem to. Être en train de, to be in the middle of. Faire en sorte de, to make sure of. Faire exprès de, to do on purpose. Notice that all those examples have infinitives which you would need to change to match the person who's in charge of the verb, but the following examples are all impersonal. That is, you have an il or a se, and you don't need to change the verb to be in any other form. Il s'agit de, it's about. C'est important de, it's important to. C'est facile ou difficile de, it's easy or difficult to. C'est une bonne idée de, it's a good idea to. C'est une bonne façon de, it's a good way to. Here are 3 little phrases without verbs, which use de and then an infinitive. Au lieu de, instead of. Avant de, before. And afin de, in order to. Finally, there are 3 de structures which can be used as replacements for vouloir, to want to, devoir, to have to, and pouvoir, to be able to. These 3 are modal verbs which are always followed by a second infinitive and nothing else. But there are some nice de structures which are commonly used, which you could use to vary your vocabulary. Vouloir has the synonym avoir envie de, to feel like. Devoir has the synonym être obligé de, to be obliged to. And pouvoir has the synonym être capable de, to be capable of. I encourage you to write these phrases down, to memorize them, to understand them, and to start to incorporate them into your French vocabulary.